Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Introduction. God is love, says St. John. When I first tried to write this book, I thought that his maxim would provide me with a very plain high road through the whole subject. I thought I should be able to say what human loves deserved to be called loves at all, just insofar as they resembled that love which is God. The first distinction I made was therefore between what I called gift love and need love. The typical example of gift love would be that love which moves a man to work and plan and save for the future well-being of his family, which he will die without sharing or seeing. Of the second, that which sends a lonely or frightened child to its mother's arms. There was no doubt which was more like love himself. Divine love is gift love. The Father gives all he is and has to the Son. The Son gives himself back to the Father, and gives himself to the world, and for the world to the Father, and thus gives the world, in himself, back to the Father too. And what, on the other hand, can be less like anything we believe of God's life than need love? He lacks nothing, but our need love, as Plato saw, is the son of poverty. It is the accurate reflection in consciousness of our actual nature. We are born helpless. As soon as we are fully conscious, we discover loneliness. We need others, physically, emotionally, intellectually. We need them if we are to know anything, even ourselves. I was looking forward to writing some fairly easy panegyrics on the first sort of love and disparagements of the second. And much of what I was going to say still seems to me to be true. I still think that if all we mean by our love is a craving to be loved, we are in a very deplorable state. But I would not now say, with my master, MacDonald, that if we mean only this craving, we are mistaking for love something that is not love at all. I cannot now deny the name love to need love. Every time I have tried to think the thing out along those lines, I have ended in puzzles and contradictions. The reality is more complicated than I supposed. First of all, we do violence to most languages, including our own, if we do not call need love, love. Of course, language is not an infallible guide, but it contains, with all its defects, a good deal of stored insight and experience. If you begin by flouting it, it has a way of avenging itself later on. We had better not follow Humpty Dumpty in making words mean whatever we please. Secondly, we must be cautious about calling need love mere selfishness. Mere is always a dangerous word. No doubt need love, like all our impulses, can be selfishly indulged. A tyrannous and gluttonous demand for affection can be a horrible thing. But in ordinary life, no one calls a child selfish because it turns for comfort to its mother, nor an adult who turns to his fellow for company. Those, whether children or adults, who do so least are not usually the most selfless. Where need love is felt, there may be reasons for denying or totally mortifying it, but not to feel it is in general the mark of the cold egoist. Since we do in reality need one another, it is not good for man to be alone, then the failure of this need to appear as need love in consciousness, in other words, the illusory feeling that it is good for us to be alone, is a bad spiritual symptom, just as a lack of appetite is a bad medical symptom because men do really need food. But thirdly, we come to something far more important. Every Christian would agree that a man's spiritual health is exactly proportional to his love for God. But man's love for God, from the very nature of the case, must always be very largely, and must often be entirely, a need love. This is obvious when we implore forgiveness for our sins or support in our tribulations. But in the long run, it is perhaps even more apparent in our growing, for it ought to be growing, awareness that our whole being, by its very nature, is one vast need. incomplete, preparatory, empty yet cluttered, crying out for him who can untie things that are now knotted together and tie up things that are still dangling loose. I do not say that man can never bring to God anything at all but sheer need-love. Exalted souls may tell us of a reach beyond that, but they would also, I think, be the first to tell us that those heights would cease to be true graces, would become Neoplatonic, or finally diabolical illusions the moment a man dared to think that he could live on them and henceforth drop out the element of need. The highest, says the Imitation, does not stand without the lowest. It would be a bold and silly creature that came before its creator with the boast, "I'm no beggar, I love you disinterestedly." Those who come nearest to a gift love for God will next moment, even at the very same moment, be beating their breasts with the publican and laying their indigence before the only real giver. And God will have it so. He addresses our need love, "Come unto me, all ye that travail and are heavy laden." Or in the Old Testament, "Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it." Thus one need-love, the greatest of all, either coincides with or at least makes a main ingredient in man's highest, healthiest, and most realistic spiritual condition. A very strange corollary follows. Man approaches God most nearly when he is, in one sense, least like God. For what can be more unlike than fullness and need, sovereignty and humility, righteousness and penitence, limitless power and a cry for help? This paradox staggered me when I first ran into it. It also wrecked all my previous attempts to write about love. When we face it, something like this seems to result. We must distinguish two things which might both possibly be called nearness to God. One is likeness to God. God has impressed some sort of likeness to himself, I suppose, in all that he has made. Space and time, in their own fashion, mirror his greatness. All life, his fecundity. Animal life, his activity. Man has a more important likeness than these by being rational. Angels, we believe, have likenesses which man lacks, immortality and intuitive knowledge. In that way, all men, whether good or bad, all angels, including those that fell, are more like God than the animals are. Their natures are in this sense nearer to the divine nature. But secondly, there is what we may call nearness of approach. If this is what we mean, the states in which a man is nearest to God are those in which he is most surely and swiftly approaching his final union with God, vision of God, and enjoyment of God. And as soon as we distinguish nearness by likeness and nearness of approach, we see that they do not necessarily coincide. They may or may not. Perhaps an analogy will help. Let us suppose that we are doing a mountain walk to the village which is our home. At midday we come to the top of a cliff where we are, in space, very near to it because it is just below us. We could drop a stone into it. But we are no cragsmen and we can't get down. We must go a long way round, 5 miles maybe. At many points during that detour we shall statistically be far further from the village than we were when we sat above the cliff. But only statically. But only statically. In terms of progress, we shall be far nearer our baths and teas. Since God is blessed, omnipotent, sovereign, and creative, there is obviously a sense in which happiness, strength, freedom, and fertility, whether of mind or body, wherever they appear in human life, constitute likenesses and in that way proximities to God. But no one supposes that the possession of these gifts has any necessary connection with our sanctification. No kind of riches is a passport to the kingdom of heaven. At the cliff's top we are near the village, but however long we sit there, we shall never be any nearer to our bath and our tea. So here the likeness, and in that sense nearness to himself, which God has conferred upon certain creatures and certain states of those creatures, is something finished, built in. What is near him by likeness is never by that fact alone going to be any nearer. But nearness of approach is by definition increasing nearness. And whereas the likeness is given to us, and can be received with or without thanks, can be used or abused, the approach, however initiated and supported by grace, is something we must do. Creatures are made in their varying ways images of God, without their own collaboration or even consent. It is not so that they become sons of God, and the likeness they receive by sonship is not that of images or portraits. It is in one way more than likeness, for it is unison or unity with God in will. But this is consistent with all the differences we have been considering. Hence, as a better writer has said, our imitation of God in this life, that is, our willed imitation as distinct from any of the likenesses which he has impressed upon our natures or states, must be an imitation of God incarnate. Our model is the Jesus, not only of Calvary, but of the workshop, the roads, the crowds, the clamorous demands and surly oppositions, the lack of all peace and privacy, the interruptions. For this, so strangely unlike anything we can attribute to the divine life in itself, is apparently not only like, but is, the divine life operating under human conditions. I must now explain why I have found this distinction necessary to any treatment of our loves. St. John's saying that God is love has long been balanced in my mind against the remark of a modern author, M. Denis de Rougemont, that love ceases to be a demon only when he ceases to be a god, which of course can be restated in the form begins to be a demon the moment he begins to be a god. This balance seemed to me an indispensable safeguard. If we ignore it, the truth that God is love may slyly come to mean for us the converse, that love is God. I suppose that everyone who has thought about the matter will see what M. de Rougemont meant. Every human love, at its height, has a tendency to claim for itself a divine authority. Its voice tends to sound as if it were the will of God himself. It tells us not to count the cost. It demands of us a total commitment. It attempts to override all other claims and insinuates that any action which is sincerely done for love's sake is thereby lawful and even meritorious. That erotic love and love of one's country may thus attempt to become gods is generally recognized, but family affection may do the same. So, in a different way, may friendship. I shall not here elaborate the point, for it will meet us again and again in later chapters. Now, it must be noticed that the natural loves make this blasphemous claim, not when they are in their worst, but when they are in their best natural condition. When they are what our grandfathers called pure or noble. This is especially obvious in the erotic sphere. A faithful and genuinely self-sacrificing passion will speak to us with what seems the voice of God. Merely animal or frivolous lust will not. It will corrupt its addict in a dozen ways, but not in that way. A man may act upon such feelings, but he cannot revere them any more than a man who scratches reveres the itch. A silly woman's temporary indulgence, which is really self-indulgence, to a spoiled child, her living doll while the fit lasts, is much less likely to become a god than the deep, narrow devotion of a woman who, quite really, lives for her son. And I am inclined to think that the sort of love for a man's country which is worked up by beer and brass bands will not lead him to do much harm or much good for her sake. It will probably be fully discharged by ordering another drink and joining in the chorus. And this, of course, is what we ought to expect. Our loves do not make their claim to divinity until the claim becomes plausible. It does not become plausible until there is in them a real resemblance to God, to love himself. Let us here make no mistake. Our gift loves are really godlike, and among our gift loves, those that are most godlike, which are most boundless and unwearied, are in giving. All the things the poets say about them are true. Their joy, their energy, their patience, their readiness to forgive, their desire for the good of the beloved, all this is a real and all but adorable image of the divine life. In its presence we are right to thank God who has given such power to men. We may say quite truly and in an intelligible sense that those who love greatly are near to God, but of course it is nearness by likeness. It will not itself produce nearness of approach. The likeness has been given us. It has no necessary connection with that slow and painful approach which must be our own, though by no means our unaided task. Meanwhile, however, the likeness is a splendor. That is why we may mistake like for same. We may give our human loves the unconditional allegiance which we owe only to God. Then they become gods. Then they become demons. Then they will destroy us, and also destroy themselves. For natural loves that are allowed to become gods do not remain loves. They are still called so, but can become, in fact, complicated forms of hatred. Our need loves may be greedy and exacting, but they do not set up to be gods. They are not near enough by likeness to God to attempt that. It follows from what has been said that we must join neither the idolaters nor the debunkers of human love. Idolatry, both of erotic love and of the domestic affections, was the great error of 19th century literature. Browning, Kingsley, and Patmore sometimes talk as if they thought that falling in love was the same thing as sanctification. The novelists habitually oppose to the world not the kingdom of heaven, but the home. We live in the reaction against this. The debunkers stigmatize as slush and sentimentality a very great deal of what their fathers said in praise of love. They are always pulling up and exposing the grubby roots of our natural loves. But I take it we must listen neither to the over-wise nor the over-foolish giant. The highest does not stand without the lowest. A plant must have roots below as well as sunlight above, and roots must be grubby. Much of the grubbiness is clean dirt if only you will leave it in the garden and not keep sprinkling it over the library table. The human loves can be glorious images of divine love. No less than that, but also no more. Proximities of likeness which in one instance may help and in another may hinder proximity of approach. Sometimes, perhaps, they have not very much to do with it either way.